Hello, I'm Steve Olson, the Manager of Training Services for Mesa. In this video, I'd like to share a workflow where we can use an IPT file to drive a feature in a separate model, and then we can use that same IPT to be the tool for the CNC toolpath. I'm going to break the workflow down into two videos. In the first video segment here, what I'd like to cover is using an IPT file as part of a swept solid feature in another file, which is a new function in Inventor 2020. The first thing I want to show you, though, are the two tools that I'm going to use to drive these features. So I'm going to go ahead and open up my first tool here. I have kind of an edge tool. One thing to point out here is notice my Z orientation. I want my X, Y, and Z orientation to match the X, Y, and Z orientation of the door that I'm going to be using here in just a second. If I don't, it's not a big deal. I just have to make sure that I rotate this tool once I get to the other file. But if the X, Y, and Z orientation is the same, I save myself that step. But I want to take a look at the sketch here real quick. You can see it's basically just a revolve profile. I do want to point out where my origin is. This center point here is going to be essentially dropped on the center line of the toolpath and also the sweep that I do. So I want to make sure that that is accurate to where that feature is going to line up. Again, if it's not in the right location right now, I can use additional options to kind of get that offset. But it is easier for me to kind of make sure I have the origin where it is at that moment. So I'll look at the other tool really quickly. This one is more of a fancier detail. Same thing, same sketch. In this case here, I did kind of put my origin in a slightly different location. So it's a little bit more at the top of that radius. So this tool comes up beyond that point. One thing also to point out is my X, Y, and Z orientation doesn't match the door. So when I bring this into the next file, I will have to make an extra step to rotate that in the right direction. So let's go ahead and take a look at the door and bringing these two tools in and making the swept features. So here is my door. Now, one thing I do want to show you is the sketch of the door. If I turn the visibility of this on, I've got the detail path already set up to make it a little bit easier. Also, I want to make sure the tool lands on the center line of the path that I intend on using. So I have some additional parameters here to get that set up right. You'll notice that this one here kind of gets it to the edge, but this one here is to the radius instead of this corner. I actually found that if I just drop the tool at this midpoint here, the path doesn't calculate right. So I want to kind of get it to the beginning of one of these line segments, and then it seems to work out a lot better that way. But I'm going to use these parameters here in a second to drive the location of the tools that I bring in. So just kind of watch that here. We'll leave the sketch on because it'll make it easier to get these things set up right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the derive command, and I'm going to go in, I'm going to pick a tool. I'm going to pick the edge tool because that's a little bit easier to set up. So I'm going to go to edge, I'll say open, and so you can see it brings that solid right there, center to center orientation. And I'm just going to drop it there because I'm then going to use the modify, move bodies. I can select this because it's a separate solid entity, and I have a couple of different ways I can move it. Right now I'm just going to use a linear direction. So you can see here it's trying to offset it in the X direction, a set distance. What I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight this. I can pick this parameter, which is the width of the door, and I can say divided by 2. You can see now it's kind of dropping that highlight right about in the midpoint of that line. I'm going to come to this Y offset, select the height of the door, say divided by 2, and now it's going to drop it on the corner. One benefit to doing this is that if I change the size of the door, these parameters will update, which will then move the tool, which will mean my feature will update as well. So we kind of want to do these things so we don't cause more work down the line. I also want to point out that the Z offset I could use At this point, if my tooling orientation wasn't quite right, if it was too high, too low, I could offset that a set distance if I need to. I don't need to do that at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and say OK. So my tool's here now. So I'm now going to go up to sweep. In my sweep dialog, you can see here I have a swept, solid sweep is on. I can turn it off and it's going to look for a profile. I'm going to turn that back on. I'll pick this solid. Now I need to pick edge or curve. So I'm going to kind of pick my profile here. You can see it's starting to sweep that around there. I'm telling it it's a cutting operation. Because there's two solids here, it needs to know which solid it wants to cut. I'll select my door, say OK. Before I do that though, notice here, keep tool body. I'm going to leave that unchecked. So it will kind of hide or kind of act like it's getting rid of that. So I don't have an extra solid here floating around. Say OK. And now there's the detail of my around the edge. Let's repeat that. This one's going to be a little bit more complicated because of the shape of the tool and also the fact that I don't have it at the right orientation. So I'll go to Derive again. I'll pick my other tool. Say Open. So you see it's trying to bring it in. I'll just go ahead and accept it. I guess one thing to point out here in the Derive is I'm using the maintain as a separate solid. That is important because otherwise it's going to merge it into the other objects that we have in there. It's going to become part of the other solid, which that's what we don't want that. We want to keep it separate. So I'll say OK. So now this one, you can see the orientation isn't right. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go into my Modify, Move Bodies. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate it correctly. So I'm going to change this operation type to rotate about a line. I'll pick the body. And now I need to pick an axis. Underneath my origin, I should be able to pick my x-axis. There we go. And I just want to go 90 degrees. I'll say apply. You can see there it's got it rotated the right direction now. I'll make sure this is on a free drag. I'll pick the body again. And again, I have parameters here that will help me set it up in the right orientation. So the X offset needs to be this value, which you can see I've given that a meaningful name that I could key in there or pick from a parameter list. But leaving the sketch turned on is making this a lot easier. So I've got it picked to the right location. I'll go ahead and say OK. Now that's where I want it to be. I'll go back and do the sweep again. So sweep solid is still on. Pick that solid. Pick my path as this loop. Now this one is a little bit trickier. Every time I've told it to cut and I pick that solid, it kind of ends up doing this weird operation where it doesn't keep it. It kind of turns everything off. It kind of error. It doesn't really error, but it causes some odd behavior. So what I'm going to do in this case, I'm going to tell it it's going to create a new solid. So it's going to create a separate solid entity. Again, we'll keep the tool body off. We'll say OK. And so now I've got a solid here inside the other one. So how do I get it to actually cut? Well, this is where the combine would come in. I tell it the base feature is my door. My tool body is the body that got created. You can see I can tell it to keep the tool body. I don't want it to do that. And instead of joining, I'm going to tell it to cut. So it's going to subtract the solid from the sweep from the solid of the door. I'll say OK, and there we go. So then if I turn off my sketch, just so you can see what we've got a little bit better, I've got it as if that tool swept around there, around the edge and around the inner detail. So I'm going to go ahead and save this then. So let me recap real quickly what I did in this video. I had two part files that I had created as my tool, simplified tools. And I then used the derive function to bring each one in. I used parameters from this base feature or the sketch of that base feature to get the tool to a corner or the beginning of a line segment. Because if we don't, the sweep kind of calculates kind of odd, and it works out a lot easier to do this. Then I used the sweep command, and I told it to pick a solid. I then picked my path, and then the first time around I did the cut For some reason, the second feature, the second tool, doesn't like cutting it. It just kind of causes some weird behavior. So I found that I could tell it to create a separate solid, and then I could use the combine command to subtract that new solid from the original one. So in the next portion of this workflow, what we're going to do is we're going to take this part into the CAM environment. We're then going to add tools to our tool library for each of these parts. We're going to have them kind of imported as tools into the tool library. Then we're going to create 2D contours using those tools to derive the tool paths. Thank you for taking time to watch this video. I hope you found the information useful that you can apply to your normal workflows. If you have any questions or comments, you can feel free to email me at my email address there on the screen. And as always, thanks for watching.